I call the honourable member for Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise this morning to add my voice in opposition to this legislation, and unlike the member previous, I do question the government's motives in relation to this piece of legislation. I think this is a purely political piece of legislation at the moment. This is not an environmental piece of legislation, and I think that's evidenced by the lack of detail within the legislation that we see. You have to question, Mr Deputy Speaker, when you hear a procession of Labor Party backbenchers speaking on this bill, their credentials in terms of their ability to understand science or the weather. And we've heard a wide-ranging report on the weather over the next 100 years. We've seen amateur scientists, wannabe weather readers. It feels like most of the members of the Labor Party's backbench have missed their calling in life, Mr Deputy Speaker, because they seem to know what's going to happen over the course of the next 100 years with a whole degree of certainty. Whereas every scientific report or science that I read is very conflicted about what is going to happen over the next 100 years. Let's have a look at what the Department of Climate Change in New South Wales says. Well, the Department of Climate Change in New South Wales says that there's going to be a 40-centimetre sea level rise in the next 30 years, and yet the Department of Climate Change in Queensland and Victoria say there's going to be a 30-centimetre rise. And, I don't feel like climate change recognises state borders, Mr Deputy Speaker. I don't think once you cross over there from our great state of New South Wales to Queensland, there's going to be a drop in the sea level. The fact is they don't know. They can't figure it out. And that's the debate that is happening and raging around the planet at the moment. There is a great question about the science. And so anybody, of course, that raises any point in relation to the science or the lack of certainty about what will happen over the next 100 years is labelled a sceptic. I can tell you one thing, Mr Deputy Speaker. I am sceptical of the ability of every member of the Labor Party's backbench to tell me what is going to happen with the weather over the next 100 years. I'm sceptical about their ability to understand science. I'm sceptical about their ability to find carbon on the periodic table. I'm sceptical of a whole range of things. What I'm very sceptical about is the government's strategy of reducing carbon pollution and the long-term emissions by 60% of 2000 levels by the year 2050. I feel like it's a deeply flawed concept. The member for Oxley raised the matter of GM, and I think finding a market-based solution to emissions or greenhouse gases is probably the only way that we will be successful in the long term in achieving this. But at the moment, with the scheme in front of us, this is the only certainty that will come out of this is that we will lose jobs in Australia. The only certainty here is that we will put all of our industries at a competitive disadvantage, a serious competitive disadvantage, when you consider that America, the largest economy in the world, will be protecting their industries 100% till 2025, and yet we are here today rushing in a scheme that will put all of our export industries at a massive competitive disadvantage. It defies a certain logic, Mr Deputy Speaker. I do think that when you consider what the member for Oxley said about General Motors, this is a fascinating point to me, because if you go to America and you go to the United States and you look at what kinds of cars they drive these massive emitting, they're more like tanks, the cars they drive over there. And so you get a situation where the market naturally has come to the conclusion people have stopped buying these heavy emitting vehicles, large vehicles, and therefore the market is signalling to those companies they cannot sustain their current level of economic activity. What governments have been trying to achieve in the environmental space for decades coming to fruition through the market. People do not want big cars anymore. And yet what does the government do in the United States? It steps in to bail out the big car industries, when the fundamental problem or the fundamental challenge for that industry is people don't want big cars anymore. Yeah. They don't want cars that emit so much. That is a good thing. That is a signal that governments have been trying to forecast and create for a long time. It's the kind of thing we need to be able to replicate without a punitive and harsh emissions trading scheme that will threaten so many jobs within this country. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I simply want to rise at this juncture in time. We're limited in what we can say here this morning. The government has guillotined debate in a certain sense. We don't have the chance to reflect on all of the measures within this scheme. I simply want to record that the carbon pollution reduction scheme here is flawed in its objective. It is being rushed in on a purely political basis without any idea about how we are going to sustain our industries in the long term against some very serious challenges. And we ought to wait, we ought to review, we ought to have the necessary detail before we proceed. It's entirely proper that the Leader of the Opposition has sought to amend these bills. It's entirely proper that we are working to get a productivity report, and I oppose this legislation.
The honourable member's time has expired.